In times of emergencies, we look to the government to try to respond quickly, decisively, mobilize the whole society to deal with the emergency. And two emergencies come to mind immediately. The first, of course, is war, some kind of national security emergency. And the other is pandemics, a spread of a disease. It's spreading like wildfire. You have to act quickly. Now, the problem with giving government emergency powers, and we've seen this repeatedly. Historically, if we go back to World War I, there was a national emergency, and the government went way beyond its normal scope and imposed absurdly restrictive conditions that seem to have very little to do with the conduct of the war itself. Even in World War II, when you look at the level of restrictions within the United States, some of them, of course, reasonable, but others not reasonable. One could even put in this context the internment of the Japanese Americans in World War II. I realize it's a debate, but that's the point. It's not obvious that people who are citizens of the U.S. from another country were fighting with. Think about it. In World War II, we were also fighting with Italy. Do we round up all the Italian Americans in the United States and lock them up? No, this was FDR's decision, and I think looking back on it, it's certainly debatable. Now, the pandemic resulted in all kinds of restrictions, not only here, but around the world. And the World Health Organization, which is not so much a governmental as a transnational and intergovernmental body, now wants to have what they call a global pandemic preparedness treaty. Well, this is a naked power grab by the WHO. Why? Because the WHO is basically saying, well, listen, the problem with these pandemics is that they cross national borders. And since they cross national borders, you need an international organization like, well, of course, us, to have all this power. And the power is to coordinate the global response of different countries. So they want the countries to agree to a kind of international treaty, deputizing the WHO to be able to, decide what's an epidemic. Right there, you've got to sort of hit the pause button, because there could be things that, there's a Ebola crisis in Africa. Does that make it a global pandemic? Well, the WHO gets to say. And the WHO then gets to decide what are the strategies that these countries should pursue. Now, right away, you see not only this centralized sort of dictatorial organization, but the organization itself has shown that it's worse than useless. Let's turn to COVID. Has the WHO figured out how we got COVID, how it started, where it came from? No. Now, the WHO will say, well, we tried to find out, but the Chinese blocked us. Well, what good are you if you are this international organization? Why didn't you make a global stink at the very least and try to mobilize countries around the world to put pressure on China instead of just saying, okay, well, our WHO researchers got off the plane and they weren't really allowed to go to a lot of areas, so they got on another plane and flew back. Well, that's not the kind of organization we want to entrust with global pandemics, is it? Under the Trump administration, Trump basically said, we don't like the WHO. They've become a pawn of China. The U.S. is going to get out of the World Health Organization. Of course, when Biden came in, he decided the exact opposite. Let's put the United States back in the World Health Organization. And my guess is that the Biden people are going to try to strengthen the power of the World Health Organization, and they'll be sympathetic to this idea of a global pandemic preparedness treaty. But a group of Republicans in the House and also in the Senate, as well as a bunch of conservative independent organizations. I'm thinking of organizations here like the Act for America, Eagle Forum, Women's Rights Without Frontiers, Center for Security Policy, Liberty Council. So all these groups are coming together and they're basically saying, no, we should not sign any global pandemic treaty. Why? Because first of all, we don't trust the World Health Organization. Look at the horrible job that they did. But also, number two, there's the concept of national sovereignty. Wait a minute. If there's a problem and it's, let's just say, a global pandemic, why doesn't the United States decide how are we as a country going to respond to this pandemic? Why would we want to confer? Why would we want to give up our ability to respond in our own way to a transnational organization that's going to adopt some kind of one-size-fits-all solution? Why do we want to give somebody else the power to tell us what to do? So now the fact checkers, who are obviously, a lot of them just thoroughly dishonest. They go, well, that's not really what this treaty is. The treaty, and they're right, the treaty does pay lip service to the idea of national sovereignty. It says things like, although we will develop general policies at the WHO, they will be applied with due accommodation at the local level. So the WHO is not willing to say, basically, we become the dictators of the world when it comes to health. But in effect, that's what treaties and these kinds of things do. As a practical matter, they confer authority on the agency. Think, for example, within the United States, when we give federal agencies like the FDA the power to coordinate decisions about, let's say, the Food and Drug Administration regarding food and drugs, well, they basically decide, well, from now on, we tell you what to do. From now on, if a corporation makes a product, we decide if it's allowed or it's not allowed. And so although the original idea might have been that we will coordinate with local health agencies, we will make these decisions cooperatively and together, you retain a good deal of discretion. As a practical matter, all of that disappears when push comes to shove. And there's also the issue of when you have a kind of emergency atmosphere, by and large, who goes, this is the way it's got to be, because after all, we're dealing with a global pandemic. And I think it's wise that these Republicans and conservative organizations are now saying, not so fast.